Thank you. I'm Sandra Ham, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today about social sequence analysis and just giving an overview of this analytical method. I guess was asked to give just a little bit more information about myself. I'm currently a statistician in CHESS, or the Center for Health and the Social Sciences. Before that, I was a graduate student in the Divinity School, and I came here from the CDC in Atlanta, where I was managing physical activity surveillance. And before that, I had another life as a manufacturing engineer, process engineer. So this social sequence analysis sort of, in a way, kind of the thinking fits in with all those other things that I had been doing in the past. So I'm going to go through a lot of slides today, and I'd like to have this more as a discussion. So if questions come up, please ask as we go along. Okay, several objectives for the talk today. First one is just to give a very brief history of social sequence analysis, to give some examples of research questions that can be answered using social sequence analysis, to describe or list the types of data sources that are amenable to being analyzed using this method. And then most of the talk will be a broad overview of sequence analysis capabilities using one particular software package. So I'm going to go through and show examples of sequences and the different ways that they can be visualized, go through some exploratory analysis methods, and show how modeling can be done with social sequence data. I'm going to briefly talk about a few limitations of the data and the software packages that are available for use. Okay. Social sequence analysis is a method for exploring longitudinal categorical data. There are other methods that are used for looking at longitudinal continuous data and other methods for looking at categorical data that's not longitudinal. This one sort of fills a gap where data are both longitudinal and categorical. And what it does is it takes a trajectory over time of categorical states and puts them together as sequences and treats those sequences as a single unit of observation. So in that way, this method is holistic in ways that other statistical methods are not. We typically look for patterns over time in the data, and we look for maybe typical patterns or most frequent patterns, or even some of the least frequent patterns. Sequence analysis provides good exploratory data analysis tools. It's much better for EDA than for confirmatory kind of modeling and other analyses. Okay, some other methods that are related but not quite sequence analysis include multi-level models for nominal and ordinal data, survival analyses, Markov chain models, and probabilistic suffix trees, and the aligning techniques that are used in biology and genomics. Okay, very brief history. In 1986, Andrew Abbott actually started this sort of subfield of sequence analysis with his seminal studies of folk dancing and professionalization of occupations. Throughout the 1990s, there was a growing literature, but still small, on occupational and family life course trajectories, which is where the method was used most frequently. In 2002, several software packages started to become available. So TDA software was an early one. In 2006, the SQ-ADOS model for Stata became available. CHISA software was released in 2007 to take care of some of the more complex questions that were being asked of those longitudinal sequence data. In 2008, Terminer software was developed excuse me, by the Institute for Demographic and Life Course Studies at the University of Geneva. And that today is the software package that is most developed and is actively being improved. And this is used in R. Okay. Last year, there was a major sequence analysis conference held in Lausanne, Switzerland. There was also notable expansion into other areas of science, like political science and economics. And there was an online course that was conducted by the group at University of Geneva at Case Western Reserve. So a bunch more folks were trained in how to do sequence analysis using Terminer. And it was mostly beginners who took this course. So that should increase the amount of literature that's coming out in the next few years. Okay, moving on to the research questions. Here are just some examples.
Just a question. So you're going to
Sure.
talk about how it's different from other forms of sequence alignment? You mentioned it's different from genomic and other kinds, or are we going to get to that?
A little bit. We'll talk about that near the end again. So the research questions, part of it does come in with the research questions because they are different from genomics questions. So the research questions are typically about the sequencing and about the timing and about the duration of events or states that people might be in over over a time period. So we might ask, what are the most frequent sequences of life events? We might ask, what are the most frequent transitions from one event to another? So for example, somebody might be transitioning from higher education to their first job. And being in higher education would be one state, being in the first job would be another state, and the transition would be between the two of them, and a life event would be getting the first job. So another question might be, how often did life transition from one to another occur in a certain birth cohort, and at what age range did these occur? Another question, what is the order and duration of time spent in different life stages? What is the variability of ordering and time spent in life stages? How do trajectories of life stages vary generationally in a population? We can get into use this method for some pretty detailed questions and drill down into a longitudinal data set. So it's like we can ask, what are some general types of life stage trajectories? We can ask if there are standard trajectories of a certain kind or of a certain phenomena, a set of behaviors. We can ask, why are some people more at risk to follow a chaotic trajectory or to stay in one state for a long period of time? And we can ask, how is the life trajectory related to age, sex, race, ethnicity, acculturation, and the social environment? So the data sources that we use for social sequence analysis are longitudinal surveys with individual follow-ups. And that might be from panel data, or it could be retrospective biographical data, or from administrative data, such as censuses or tax data. So comparing this with something like genomics analysis, we're typically dealing with much shorter sequences than looking at DNA and protein structures, which is one of the differences. And the other is that we're looking typically between people rather than sort of within a large set of genomics data. The tools that are available in social sequence analysis, especially through Terminer, are used for exploratory analysis, are used for plotting, for descriptive statistics, clustering, and modeling. Yep.
One thing I'm interested in is state seems like a really fundamental idea. This particular method, is there like a formal definition of what a state is? Is there like a way of figuring out what constitutes a state? Because you could say that school could be a state, but there are substates that can be broken up into. Where do you sort of draw the line between?
That is a very good question. It was about, is there a formal definition of a state? So for something like being in school could be one state, or it could be broken up into smaller units within school. And a lot of that is kind of getting into the art of using sequence analysis, where it's up to the analyst to define what would constitute a state or an event with a particular duration. And it also plays into the limits of the analysis method, because there are definitely some limits to the size of the data set that would require making some of those decisions about looking at finer or coarser granularity in time. Yes?
So is there any, something that hasn't been done, for instance, in the kind of genomic sequencing world or rarely done, and I can think of just a couple of examples, is kind of looking at higher order syntax, right? And so I think this relates to this question of states. You've got kind of coarse-grained and fine-grained states, right? And so at some level, but in a social setting, it seems obvious that you would certainly want to kind of look at higher and lower level sequences simultaneously. In some sense, the higher level sequences or syntax of these higher level structures, like education and work, constrain meaningful lower level ones. Are you looking at? I mean, are any of the approaches that you're exploring take into account this essential nesting?
That's a good question, and it bumps into the technical limitations of the method as far as it's been developed so far. So this is an area that is still pretty much in its infancy as far as the algorithms and the software goes. So a lot of people have been interested in looking at both the higher and lower levels of social phenomena together, and those would be considered, say, like two channels, higher level channel and maybe a lower level finer grain channel, and looking at those simultaneously. The software package by Elzinga Chiza that was released in 2007 was developed with some algorithms to look at that specifically. I don't have any familiarity with that, and I haven't used it. The other methods in Treminer and Stata haven't gotten that far in their development to be able to handle those kinds of multi-channel sequences yet. There are some ways to handle simple multi-channel sequences, and I'll show you that in the example that I'm going to use throughout most of the presentation. Okay. We're talking about events and states. Events occur at points in time. States occur over durations of time. And the transitions are an event is a transition between two states of interest. Time can be represented several different ways in sequence analysis, depending on how the data were collected and analysts' decisions about how to handle the data for further analysis. So at the top, we have simple ordering, just an ordinal scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we can look at, say, 5 events if we don't care too much about the timing or duration of them. We could also look at a process scale. If we have a continuous time, we can say that, okay, there is a time 1 and a time 2 that we're interested in. Things happen over time 3 and 4 that we're not interested in, and then an event happens at time 5. And we might have data for those 3 points and use that for further analysis. We could also look at calendar time. So we can look at specific days, months, or years. And here I have examples of looking at years and months. So process time is actually probably the most valuable of these 3 when looking at life course data, because then you can align people on age and say, okay, beginning at age 18 and following people for 20 years, what were their trajectories? Rather than looking at some people who started at age 18 in 1978 and then some started at age 18 in 1994. If that difference over time doesn't really matter, but you really are just interested in the differences in trajectories, then process time is a valuable tool to use. Okay, I have several examples of data structures here. First one is for time-stamped events. And this goes along with the first kind of simple time scale. So we have times 1, 2, and 3 for 3 people, and we have their states, A, B, and C. We could also look at process time. So for the same 3 people, we could have time 1, 9, 26, or 1, 2, and 20, and then have events A, B, and C. But you notice over here, for this person at time 2, events B and C occurred at that time point. So we can construct an alphabet that includes both of those. Yes?
Does this typically require the same number of observations within each ID? Like, does it need to be balanced even if you don't have the same observation time for each individual?
Okay, yes. The question is, does the data need to be balanced with the same number of observations per person? And it makes the analysis much easier if it does have the same number of observations, or at least covers the same time period or process time. When the data are not balanced, then need to consider the pattern of missing data, where it occurs within the trajectory, how much missing data is acceptable within the sample and within the time period, and deal with it either by deleting some observations, or deleting some of the time periods, or adding another type of event for missing data to deal with it. Okay. Here is a third kind of data structure for time-stamped events. And this one uses calendar time with another event, left home, married, or a child. And we'll see a lot more of this very shortly. Okay. So here's another kind of data structure, and this is state sequences. So if we just look at the first line here with marital status, this would be considered one sequence, ranging from 1930 to 1933 for one person who was single in 1930 and 31, and then married in 32 and 33. If we're considering multiple channels, we would say that marital status, location, and having a child or children would be 3 channels, and this would be a multi-channel sequence. And the data structure could have either marital status for everyone, or have these 3 rows like this that would be somehow combined. So another data structure that can be handled by Terminer is spell data that has a starting time and an ending time with a state or an event that corresponds to each of those spells. So for spell data, there are multiple rows per person. For state sequences, there's typically 1 row per person. And for the time-stamped events, it's multiple rows per person. For the next few slides, I'm going to use an example data set. This is actually one that comes with Terminer software, or the Terminer package for R. And this came from the Swiss Household Panel in 2002. The Swiss Household Panel was a retrospective biographical survey that covered 16 years of family life course event data, among other things. So the data that are available with Terminer include events of leaving home, first marriage, first childbirth, and first divorce. It also includes some demographic variables, sex, birth year, nationality, language of the questionnaire, which was, for this questionnaire, was French, German, and Italian, because it was a Swiss Household Panel. It included religious affiliation, religious participation, and fathers and mothers' social status. And a subset of the data of 2,000 people was included with Terminer. So those are just some descriptive statistics about the sample itself. It was 45% men and 55% women. The respondents were born between 1908 and 1957. So I divided them up into 4 age cohorts. from 1908 to 1918, 1919 to 29, 30 to 45, and 46 to 57. There were 3 different interview languages that were used in the survey, and 4 different groups of religion: Catholic, Protestant, no religion, and everybody else. So it included a few Muslim, a few Jewish, and a few others. Okay. Moving on to talking about sequences and how sequences are represented. Sequences use an alphabet. So an alphabet, say A, is a finite set of symbols or events for events or states. So for our ship data, we can say that living with parents might have a symbol P for living with parents. L would represent having left home that year. M would represent being married in a year. C represents having children, and D represents being divorced. So the alphabet that is used in the ship data has 8 characters, and they include the events and states and also combinations. So we have, P for living with parents, LM, LM for left home and married, C for having a child, LC, left home and having a child, LMC, left home, married, and having a child, and then divorced, D.
So LM is a different character than L or M? Okay.
Right. Okay, so an event sequence, a K, is an ordered list of K successively chosen elements of this alphabet A. So we can think of that typically as an ordered list, X1, X2, all the way through XK. And a way to represent that in the sequence data might be P, L, M, and MC, which, going back a couple slides, would be for living with parents in 1930, having left home in 1931, being married in 1932, and being married with a child in 1933. So here's 2 ways of depicting the 10 most frequent sequences in the ship data. So here I'm showing you the long format. So there are 16 years, and there's 1 character for every year. So the most frequent sequence was living with parents for all 16 years. The next most frequent sequence was living with parents for 6 years and having left home for the next 10. Another way of depicting a sequence is this condensed form, which shows living with parent for 16 time periods, or living with parent for 6 time periods and then left home for 10 time periods, and so on. So we have down here living with parents and then having left home, married with child or children for the rest of the duration of the study.
Some of these states seem to be exclusive and some not, and some seem to be follow in a necessary order and some not. For example, you have to be, in order to be divorced, you have to have been married previously. In order to be have left home, you can't be living with parents. So those 2 are exclusive. The other ones are in sequence. Is there a more efficient way to represent the necessity of some sequences happening, or the necessity of exclusivity between events?
That is a question that comes up more in the analytical methods when trying to compare sequences and say that one sequence is more or less similar to another. They might be similar by having similar subsequences, like being married then divorced. But the question about the necessity of it is really more, it doesn't come into the method as much as maybe the study design and the theoretical foundation of it. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but it
Satisfying.
wouldn't govern your rules about probabilities of being in one state at any particular moment in time.
No, the alphabet is typically chosen as a method of looking at the data that is meaningful for the particular research study. So it's pretty much arbitrary and up to the analyst's decision.
So the assumption here seems to be that people start off in P. That's like the starting state.
Mm-hmm.
So leaving home is, or is it something that needs to be, or like, before leaving home, you have to first be home. So any state that doesn't have an L in it is assumed that you're living at home. Would that be accurate? Because like if
all
you
these
don't
married
start
people at home.
Well,
if you don't start at home, then the idea of leaving home is not being relevant in the first place, right? So it seems to me that everyone here is like assumed to have started at home.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, this data was put on a process scale. So at time 1, everybody, or almost everybody, is living with parents at home. And then it might be, I think it actually starts at age 16 and goes on
So
for
L is
16
really
years.
left parents.
Yes, left parents.
So everyone who doesn't have an L has not left their parents.
Right.
So there are married people living at home.
Yes, there are.
Most married people.
Yes,
The
there are.
The
Well,
M's are
yes.
Okay.
We'll see
Just
that.
wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
And do you have an L for the rest of your life if you're not living with your parents?
Yeah, if you don't get married or have children, then you would just have an L for the rest of your life.
But if you do get married and have children,
Then it would be
You have an L
LM,
plus.
LMC.
right? No, I understand.
Okay.
But the L persists forever. Okay.
Yeah,
So it's not an event. It's a state.
right.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, now we're starting to get into the pictures. And I hope this might clarify some things, or maybe not. I hope it will. Okay, so we have a picture, a sequence index plot of the 20 most frequent sequences in the data set out of the 2,000 people. This is sort of like the base and the bread and butter of sequence analysis, especially in Minor, but Stata does it too. So we have, starting along the x-axis, here, A15. I guess you can think of that as age 15, yeah, all the way through age 30. So those are the ages of the time that the data were collected for. It was a retrospective biographical study, so people reported. Along the y-axis, where's this mouse? Okay. Y-axis shows 20 sequences covering 34% of all the sequences that are in the sample. The height of each of the bars is proportional to the number of times that sequence occurred in the sample. The colors of the bars show, and the changes of the colors show the states at any given age. So the most frequent one at the very bottom shows people who lived with their parents for all 16 years. The one right above that shows living with parents through age, I guess, 20, and then beginning in 21, having left. The one right above that, living with parents up until age 24, and then being married but still living with parents. Yes.
What demographic was this data collected for? I'm just curious.
I think it was just a representative sample of, SHIP, I guess, was an ongoing panel survey, and this was 1 year of data collection that was abstracted.
Within the United States?
It was in Switzerland.
Oh, Switzerland. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. And remember that this does cover people who were born in 1908, so the data were for what they were doing in the 1930s and 40s.
Is it 3.9% of all possible combinations of
It's 33.9%. Yeah. It's one of the problems with, Terminer makes very nice graphics, but they aren't easily editable.
What's it 33.9% of?
Of the entire sample, of all the sequences in the sample. Yes.
So then does that mean that everyone else in the sample have completely dissimilar sequences from each other, and there isn't any common pattern between them at all?
Yes, there is. And actually, I have several graphics that show all of the sequences for everybody, and several that show subsets like this.
So it's not a percentage of all the possible combinations of
No.
of alphabet.
No, it's the percentage of everybody who is in the data set,
Okay.
which doesn't represent all possible combinations.
Okay. Yeah.
So is this one level at which you could imagine a kind of like induced coarse graining, right? So imagine that you have all these sets, and then the coarse graining is at the level of essentially, the modal units, right? So you've got a bunch of people who kind of leave, roughly at the same time to become whatever yellow is, married. So is that? I mean, you said that there's some ways in which that coarse graining occur. One can imagine kind of semantically at the level of actually the codes. You kind of group them. Another could be at the level of induced sequences. Is that does this do that? Is that something that people think about?
What do you mean by level of induced sequences?
Well, some of these look pretty similar, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 and 7 and 9 are all green followed by yellow within, like a year or something like that. I'm just saying, it just seems like there are a number of, well, not just, 3 and 5. And so, so I just mean, like induced patterns, you can imagine just coarse graining on top of those patterns to create some kind of higher level syntax. It seems pretty self-evident.
Yes. So clustering methods are also one of the tools that are used with this kind of data. So that would cluster sequences 3, 5, 7, 8, and 3, 5, 7, 8, and 10 all together into one cluster. And we'll see that later.
What are the features that they cluster on?
There are several options for how to determine what to cluster on. One of them is the ordering of the states. One of them is the presence of the states, like green then yellow. Another one would be the timing. So doing it at age 20 versus age 25, could be considered similar or could be considered different. We'll get to that later on. So the sequence data differs from other kinds of data because it has that time dimension to it. So we can do more things with it. And what we have here, so this pink bar sort of shows that we can look at a sequence longitudinally and describe it, try to understand it. We could also look at a whole sample of sequences at one point in time and look at the transverse characteristics and try to understand those. So get to the longitudinal and transversals. And we can look at a pair of sequences and try to compute how similar or how different those are and do some paired analyses. We can look at groups of sequences and do some clustered analyses. We can bring in some external data for any of these and run models on it. I'm going to show you a few examples of each of these. So here's one that shows sequence index plots for the entire sample by the age cohort or birth year cohort. So you can see that overall, there's a lot of green in all of these. Down here, the youngest cohort has more purple or having left home without getting married or having children, compared with the other groups. And let's see, there's also, a lot of more yellow or just being married and living at home in the two groups in the middle.
How are these figures sorted? So it seems like there was sort of an implicit clustering going on in the graphs. That the top level was people who transitioned to orange and sort of a sort based on that. Was that implicit in how the graphs were created, or did you do that specifically?
I did that specifically. The sequences by themselves, if they are just in any random order, it would be very difficult to understand what's going on, because it would be like looking at these 20 most frequent sequences, but a much higher stack of them. So there's a way to sort them, say from the left or from the right, so that it groups all the same colors together. It makes it easier to see what's going on when that's part of the question that you're asking. So with this one, I'm looking again at the 20 most frequent sequences, but instead of for the entire sample overall, looking at it by the age cohort. And we can see that they do differ. There's more orange in the oldest group and more of the purple in the youngest group. We can look at the modal state sequence out of all of the sequences that are in the sample. So what this shows is that the modal sequence is green all the way through age 25 or living with parents, and then having left married and having children after age 25. Excuse me. The heights of the bars on this graph, well, see, each bar shows a transversal distribution at a particular age. And we can see that at age 15, almost everybody was living with parents, and that proportion who was living with parents declined over time. And then the proportion that was that had left and was married with children increased. We can also ignore the duration information and just look at the simple ordering of states. So going back to the time depiction, the very top one, we can see that in this data set there are 5 states, or at least the most complex sequence used 5 states. And this shows the proportional distribution of the combination of states, or orderings of states. So the most frequent one was parent, then left, then left, married, and child. Or yeah, left married, and then left married with child. And then the next most frequent one was living with parents, and then having left. And then the next most frequent one was living with parents, and then married, still living with parents. Okay, here's the state distribution by time plot. This is one of the transversal statistics, or graphical methods. So it shows, again, if you can think of each of these as a column, this is similar to the modal state, at least over to age 25, where we have the same data for the proportion of the sample that was living with parents. And then here we can see what the proportion that wasn't living with parents were doing at those ages.
Wait, so this doesn't include everybody in the sample?
It does include everybody in the sample.
So what about the people, but everybody in this sample, like, I'm not seeing anyone who got married.
This is a state distribution bias, not a sequence.
Yeah, so this takes away the ordering and just looks at the distribution at any age. We can also look at the mean time spent in each state. And I ran this by age cohort again. We can see the number of years on average in the sample, or the cohort, that were spent in each of the 8 states. So we noticed that for the group from 1908 to 1918, they spent on average about 11 years with parents. and that decreased to the youngest group that spent about 7 years on average with their parents. Okay, so there are some other statistical characteristics that can be run or calculated for sequence data. So we're not just looking at the sequence charts, but we can do some other things with it. So we can count the number of transitions for each sequence. We can count the number of subsequences, and a subsequence might be 1 year, or 2 years at a time, or 3 years at a time. So it could be like being with parent and then parent, or it can be parent, parent, then left. And each of those would be considered subsequences. So in this data set, there would be hundreds of subsequences that could be considered, excuse me, and counted. There are also some other measures of entropy, or the general sort of variability of states within a sequence. And then turbulence and complexity are both composites of the number of transitions, number of subsequences, and entropy in different ways. So on the left, the bar chart shows the distribution of the number of transitions per sequence in the data set. So most people had one transition, or had 2 states during the 16-year period, and that ranged from having no transition or being in the same state to having 4 transitions or being in 5 states. So after calculating complexity, we can do things like compare the distributions of complexity by group. So here I ran it by cohort, and it can. The complexity is actually a combination of the number of transitions and the entropy of the variability of the numbers of states that are in a particular sequence.
Where's the entropy?
Entropy of the distribution of states is it information theoretic entropy over the distribution of states, not taking into account time or?
I don't remember the equation offhand. I can get it for you if you're really interested. I'll get the reference for you.
Just trying to get an intuitive sense of that.
So what might help is that graph would be not possible for one person per bar. That would not be a possible graph, because the complexity seems it seems that you have to have many sequences that are grouped together to figure out what the entropy is. This is not something that you can calculate for a single sequence.
Yes, it can. Yeah, so
it can be calculated for a single sequence?
A single sequence can have an entropy score and also a complexity score.
Okay. How would that work? Like, how would you talk about the variability of the number of states for a single person?
You could use, actually, entropy or complexity or turbulence are 3 different ways to talk about it.
Maybe another question that might get to, maybe we don't, it seems like you don't have a great idea, but maybe one thing is that is this measure of entropy dependent upon the data? Or is it generic, right? It just needs to know how many sequences you have. Or is it like, well, we're gonna be able to get a sense that this is the most probable distribution, and so that's gonna and that means that so that the entropy measure is really going to depend upon the distribution of sequences in a particular case.
Let's go to the next one. I might be able to clarify things a little bit better. These are graphs of transversal entropy over time. So entropy can be calculated for each year within a group. And here we see, like looking at
entropy over the distribution of state types.
Yeah. So
wider distribution, then you have higher entropy.
Yeah. So entropy would be related to something like this. So here entropy would be very low because there's a small number of states, and most people are in one state. If there are a larger number of states, entropy is higher, and if the distribution of states is more even, so I mean, if there might be like 20% in each of 5 states, then entropy is even higher. So we can see that entropy was very low early on in the study and increased over time. And it increased earlier for women than for men, and it increased earlier for the later age cohorts, and increased sooner for the later age cohorts, and later for the earlier ones.
Sandy, so as I'm a little rusty on the details myself, but another way to think about some of these measures would be entropy accounts for the number of transitions within the sequence, irrespective of the alphabet. Okay, so you could just go flip-flop back and forth between 2 states over the course of the sequence and have a very high entropy. Complexity would take account for the number of states that are possible, or the number of states that are used. So you cycle through all 5 states once, or maybe you cycle through them 15 times. So it does not take account of the alphabet size, it never does.
And the turbulence is well.
And the turbulence, I forgot.
Yeah, this scatter plot matrix here shows roughly how they are related to each other.
I think the take-home message is that there are many different ways of characterizing the sequences on an individual basis. Those individual measures at the sequence level can be aggregated to something like an average turbulence per defining characteristic. So you can say, well, for men, the turbulence is such and such. For women, the turbulence is something else. And we have ways of comparing those.
Yeah,
standard modeling techniques.
Yeah, thank you. And my objective here is to just to show what sequence analysis is capable of doing, and here to show that it can run statistics like these to characterize sequences and groups of sequences this way, but without trying to get into the statistics of exactly what they are. We have more to do. Okay, so here's an example of modeling after calculating, say, turbulence. We can model sex, age cohort, language of interview, and religion, and see that several of these groups are related to turbulence using a linear regression model. So women have lower turbulence, or women have slightly higher turbulence. Those who interviewed in German and Italian versus French had slightly lower turbulence. Those who were born later had higher turbulence. And those with no stated religion or Protestants had higher turbulence than Catholics. Okay, moving on to, oh gosh. I knew this was going to happen. Got some of my animations screwed up. This is supposed to be in the middle of, well, actually show up in the middle of the presentation. But so dissimilarity, we're moving on to looking at pairs of sequences rather than just one sequence at a time, either longitudinally or transversely. So dissimilarity, we'll look at, calculate dissimilarity using pairs of sequences. And by doing this, we have access to advanced analytical methods that haven't been covered so far by looking just at the longitudinal and transverse graphical methods and statistics. So some examples of them are, we can look at neighborhood-based methods and look at where sequences fit into neighborhoods of sequences. We can do multidimensional scaling. We can look at discrepancy measures between sequences. We can look at ANOVA-like discrepancy analyses. We can run regression trees. We can run cluster analyses, and we can run self-organizing maps. So potential for much more than just the first basic methods. So, considering dissimilarity, and I know this is going to be fast, so I hope this is an adequate explanation. So the pairwise dissimilarity, or distance between two sequences x and y, informs about the closeness of sequences. So we have two sequences here. One of those people who lived with parents and then got married and didn't leave home. And then another one who lived with parents, then left, got married, and had children. So how do we want to define similar or different? So analysts have many choices. They can look for common subsequences. So we can say, okay, there's a subsequence here between living with parents and being married with parents. And there's a subsequence here of being married, or having left and being married and having children. And we can compare those. We could also look at the timing of when states or events occur. We can look at the ordering of the sequences. We can look at duration. We can calculate scores of multiple correspondence analysis. And that is something that's in CHISA software that to deal with something more than just the basic method and basic kinds of sequences. And we can look at transitions and define dissimilarity based on any of those. So there are, when selecting dissimilarity measures, you consider what's important for your study. So if similar timing is important, there are 3 options for calculating dissimilarities. So Terminer can calculate a longest common prefix or use Hamming or dynamic Hamming methods. If what's important is looking at similar state successions without having a strict time alignment, then Terminer can calculate a longest common sequence optimal matching kind of matrix. If what's important is sequencing of transitions, then you can look at common subsequences or optimal matching of transitions. If duration is important, there are multiple correspondence methods. If you have a reference sequence that you want to compare with everything else, and that's what's important, then many of these options can be used with a reference sequence to calculate a distance from that. If the sequences in the data set have unequal sequence lengths, and you want to normalize the distances, there are several ways to normalize distances after using some of the other methods to calculate distances. And if the data have multiple channels, you can deal with that using, by changing the alphabet like we saw here with multiple states represented in the alphabet, or analyze channels separately and then combine them with an averaging method. So here is just sort of an example of a transition rate matrix that is used for some of these methods. So for example, if we start with, we have in a year, somebody is living with parents, the rate of the following year also living with parents is 0.89 or 89% of the time. Where's my mouse? Okay. So for those who were living with parents, the next year, for 5% of those states, they had transitioned to having left home. 2% transitioned to being married. 3% transitioned to having left and being married. And 1% transitioned to left, married, and child directly from living with parents. So just want to show you what a transition. Yeah.
So looking at the direction of transition, so what seems odd, and which is why I'm asking, making sure I understand this correctly, the C to the arrow means was in child at time T and then went to another state in T.
Right.
So basically that cell, that 0.34 C to M means that people had children and then went to marriage.
Right.
So basically, this is sort of an odd likelihood that if you have a child, you're 34% likely to transition to married in the next stage.
Well, it's more than 34% of, I'm looking at the subsequences of just 2 years at a time. For those in which having a child was the first year, 34% of the time the following year was being married. And 61% of the time having a child was followed by another year of having a child without being married or having left home or the other things that go along with it. Yes?
So what this is a transition matrix for a Markov model. Is there any difference between those two things? Because to me this looks like exactly like a Markov model. Like you could put like a vector of an initial state distribution on one side of this matrix and multiply it, and then you would have the distribution after one time step. Just keep doing that, and you can do all sorts of fun things.
Yeah, you could. Markov modeling methods are sort of in development for Terminer and probably going to be coming out in the next few years. So far, it hasn't really been used with this method.
Okay, that's interesting because that is like the matrix you would use for Markov model. Like is the exact thing. So
yeah,
it's doing very similar things.
Yes.
Yeah, and it seems like if you were going to smooth the distribution, because obviously you're just looking at set time steps, that you'd want to. This is where you'd want to use those exclusive constraints that John Graham talked about, right? So which ones are possible? You'd want to only smooth across the distribution of states in which are logically possible. Because many of them aren't.
Yeah. Yeah, well, with sequence analysis, we're not generating sequences. We're taking sequences that already exist and analyzing them. So that's,
But a Markov
the
model
difference.
is projecting states in some future world that hasn't yet
Right.
existed.
Right, and sequence analysis doesn't do that. It doesn't project into the future. It only uses the data that already exists.
Okay, well, yeah, but
So
when those
there's a difference.
features get ported in there,
Yeah.
will then it be called?
Yeah. Yeah, then it will become important. Okay. So the most common method that's used for calculating pairwise dissimilarities is optimal matching. This is one that was sort of at first was developed by Needleman and Wunsch for genomics or genetics. The algorithm was published in 1970, and it was used directly in the SQADOS module in Stata, and it was also used in Terminer. It has several limitations that have been noted and described in the literature, but it's still the most commonly used method. So the optimal matching distance between two sequences, X and Y, is the minimal cost of transforming one into another, as in genomics. So it uses indels and it uses substitutions, and the analysts decide what those costs are going to be for indels and substitutions and create a substitution matrix for it. There are several options for doing this. The cost could be constant, assuming that all indels and all substitutions have the same cost. It could be based on theory related to the subject matter. Very few areas in life course research actually have theory to guide this. So that's not used very often. It can be based on state properties or transition rates in the data. So it can go back to the transition matrix and be based on that. Distances they're calculated using optimal matching can be normalized, and they're typically comprise a half triangular matrix of all the sequences that are in the data set. Okay. Once we have a dissimilarity matrix, we can start looking at some of the other tools that can be used to look at sequences. So one of them is we can look at neighborhoods of sequences. So here I have 4 groups. This is by religion. And I have 4 representative sequences for each group. So over here for Catholics, each of these sequences here represents a group of Catholics. And there is a certain distance from this representative to others in that group. So these four together represent about, I guess it's 36% of the Catholics in the sample. And up here we have symbols that kind of show the average discrepancy from the mean distance of the group, or mean distance of the representative to the center of the sample, or the mean distance to representative sequence, and overall the scores range from 0 to 25. So they were pretty close to 0, or pretty low scores for most of these. Where are they? Yeah. So with Treminer, with the neighborhood analysis, you could ask for, you could vary the number of representative sequences that you look for in the neighborhood. So you can ask for 1, you can ask for 20, you can ask for 100. And they would represent or have different coverage. So of course, if you ask for 1, it's going to have much lower coverage than if you ask for 20. So this is one of the things you can do with a dissimilarity matrix. You can also cluster. And I ran clusters on this data set and got 5 of them, or saved 5. And these, we have one which kind of labeled early parental, which is for people who were living with parents, then they left home, and then they got married and had kids. Their second cluster is for people who left and had no children. Then we have a group that left and got married, but didn't have children, and most of the divorces are in this group. We have another group that is still at home, or that left and got married and had children later. And then there's a group that is married and still living with their parents. And in this weighted data set, the early parental represents 654 people out of 2,100. And the married with parents is the smallest one, and that represents 255 people out of 2,100. So Miner can also run or create trees. So for the clustering, this shows how Treminer created the clusters. So we started up here. We're looking at the state plot, not sequence plot. Okay, and we see that in the first step of clustering, it separated the people who left, got married, and had kids from the people who just got married. And then it took this first one and separated out the people who left married and had kids with those who just left or just got married, or left and got married. And then separated that one further into those who just left and those who left and got married and got divorced. And from this second group, from the first stage of the clustering, this is the Ward's clustering method, it separated out the people who were at home but might have left and got married and had kids late from those who got married and were still at home.
So there are 15 minutes left. I just wanted to let you know.
Okay.
3:30. So just to make anyone feel comfortable, if you have to leave because of some time constraint, you're welcome to. There are 15 minutes left.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I have to go through these slides kind of quick. So this is another example of something that can be done with sequence analysis. Could also do multidimensional, or create scatter plots using multidimensional scaling. And this shows scatter plot by cluster. Can also do modeling using the cluster. So this is a logistic regression model for being in the early parental cluster versus not. And it shows that those people who have higher odds of being in the early parental cluster are women who were born in the later, and who interviewed those who interviewed in Italian or had no religion were less likely to be in the early parental cluster. This is a regression tree. So using the same variables, Terminer split the sample according to, let's say, in the first step by age cohort. Wait a minute, going from first step, age cohort. So it split out the 1946, the later age group, from the other three. And
Just a quick question about
yeah.
this. So is it, I mean, because you've got the state plot, the state distribution plots, is that suggest that this clustering method is operating on those state distributions, or is it operating on underlying sequence similarities?
It's operating on the dissimilarity matrix.
Which is over a sequence.
Over sequence, yeah.
Yeah. So with this regression, it doesn't really show remarkable differences. At the very end of it, there are groups of younger men who interviewed in French or German who look pretty different from the, younger women who were, Catholic? Or no, who interviewed in Italian. So those are people who tended to stay home after they got married. Okay, now I'm going to show a few other applications of sequence analysis methods. And all of these are from work that I've been doing at the medical school, and all of this is work in progress that hasn't been published yet. So two sets of projects. One of them is looking at surgical procedures and follow-up, and the other one is looking at courses of antibiotics, also for surgical procedures, but without the follow-up. So this first one is using a sequence index plot in ways that it wasn't really meant to be used. This uses health insurance claims data from 2003 to 2008. And what it shows is this is just a description of a sample of patients who had a certain surgical procedure. So the purple or gray here just means that a person was not even enrolled in the insurance plans that are covered in the data set. The yellow shows, for the rows, shows the duration of coverage in the by the insurance plans. So inclusion in the data set. So we can see who's eligible and who's not eligible. The different colors here, so I have one color, I think the orange one is an index surgery of interest. And the red and blue are follow-up surgeries, two different kinds of surgeries of interest. And then there are some green ones. I'm sorry, the green kind of blend with the blue. They're kind of a teal color. Are hospital admissions for any other reason. So with this plot, we have a graphical way of seeing where the index admissions occurred relative to enrollments in the insurance plans. We can see how many and relative timing of other admissions that came before the index surgery, and also all of the admissions that came after the surgery. Yes?
On the x-axis are months?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are 1 month at a time. There are 108 months covering 8 years, or 9 years of data. So this is one way that I've been using sequence analysis without doing sequence analysis. Here's another one. Most of what I showed you before was about states and state analysis. Here is a plot of events. So events don't have duration. Events have dates. So the relative date and the type of event. So here we're looking at two types of surgeries. The one is called ETV, and the other is called S. And S could be in or out. So here's an index ETV. Everybody starts here. So the size of the box indicates, or is proportional to the size of the sample that's at that state or in that event at position 1 or time 1. So at time 2, some of the sample had another ETV. More of the sample had this S in event, and a few people had this S out event. At time 3, some of those who had a second ETV went on to have a third one. Some of those who had S in went on to have another of those. And a few of those people went on to have an S out, I think. At time 4, some of the people who had an S in had an S out. And a few of those went on to have 15 surgeries after the index. So this is a graphical way of sort of depicting event sequences and what happens in a sample. Treminer can also run survival curves or create survival curves. So we had just the index ETV and any following ETV or any S surgery afterwards. Okay, here's another way that I've been using sequence analysis, and this is another way that hasn't really been or wasn't developed for this. This is using, let's see, another University Health Consortium data. So it's more healthcare claims. And this is for one surgery of a certain type. And there's like one kind of surgery is procedure 1, a different kind of surgery is procedure 2. But they're sort of related. They're both for different kinds of cancers. And antibiotics. So in this sample, or data set, there were 50 antibiotics that were used for these surgeries. I took the top 10 that were used most often and coded them with letters. The O's, like this one, B-O. The O means that that person was in the hospital today, or that day as an inpatient, but not prescribed an antibiotic. So I have, that's okay, and then there is another antibiotic here at the bottom, an X. So there's BX here. So there are 2 antibiotics that are typically used together with something else. And I just coded those as lowercase x and y to be separate. So these are sequences from an index surgery through the end of the hospital admission. And we can see just the top 7 for a certain procedure. Say overall or with no infection, and for procedure 2, we can see that both the specific antibiotics differed, and the course of treatment also varied. So procedure 1 had much shorter hospital stay and shorter course of antibiotics than the other. Small percentages of people with both of these procedures got infections. So using the same method and the same alphabet, we can see what their courses of antibiotics were. So there's an asterisk here, and the asterisk represents any of the other 40 antibiotics that were not coded with one of the first 10 letters. So for a course like, I guess like this one, where for first 3 days there were no antibiotics, and then there was one antibiotic used for 3 days, and then switch to a different one the next day, and then add another one the 3rd day for about 6 days, and then drop the 3rd, and then add the other one back, and then drop it for a few more days, and then add it back, and then drop it again. If you were to describe this using text, it would be very difficult to do, but using this method, just for data visualization, it makes it very easy to see what's going on, and to see what's going on for a lot of patients. Yes?
So one thing you mentioned earlier, and I'm curious if you would do it in this context, is this idea of what makes somebody susceptible to entering into a certain pattern or state transition pattern or kind of constancy over time. And here, it seems like, and are you doing that by putting them in a subprobabilistic model? Because here, I mean, it seems like the first question I'd ask are, what are the characteristics? So if all we know is that there's an infection, what are the characteristics of doctors and hospitals that have, sequence 1 versus sequence 2.
Right. That's where we go back and go into the data set and look at the doctors and hospitals and other characteristics of the patients, and maybe go back in their health history. With the market scan data, it can do that, and go back a few years, or at least for as long as they were enrolled in the insurance plan, and look at their records of hospital admissions and prescription drug use and outpatient services, and even doctor office visits, and look for patterns of that.
Because you cross-tab that, but it seems like you could also put them in some reasonable model
it would, yeah, not really. Yeah, I haven't gotten as far as using probabilistic models with this. All of these projects are pretty much new projects for the surgical procedures that are of interest. So the first papers are going to be descriptive epi papers coming out of this work. Yeah.
One place you could definitely take this is to make these sequences for doctors as opposed to for patients, like what, and that would give some feedback as to whether certain doctors are prescribing or under-prescribing antibiotics versus others.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lots of possibilities.
Yeah, we can definitely look at that. And looking at the sequences for infections, okay, comparing no infection to infection. The top 7 for no infections covered, like 30, 40, 50% of, 30 or 40% of the sample. But for those who had infections, every one of the courses was unique. And this was across 95 hospitals around the US.
So just to elaborate a little bit further to your question. So yeah, we in another project that Sandy and I have been working on, we have been using the cluster as a nominal variable in a regular type of modeling exercise. So rather, in our case, rather than looking at predictors of being in a particular cluster, we use cluster membership as predictors of some distal outcomes. So you can use that on both sides of the equation.
So as the so they're very heterogeneous, but are most of the infections have the same prefixes as the no infection?
What do you mean?
I mean, so like you most of these things in procedure 1 are starting with B, right? Or B, or BP.
Right.
Are most of the infections starting with B?
Well, for, let's see. No, not most of them. Some of them did. Yeah, some of them started with other antibiotics. Some of them started with no antibiotics for a day or two. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, almost done. The home stretch here. So there are some limitations that are posed by the data and the software. So one of them is in the number of sequences that can be analyzed. And the limit there is somewhere around between 5 and 10,000. And that's because of the size of the dissimilarity matrices. So the actions that a person can take if they have a data set that's larger than that, and they really want to analyze it, is to work on a representative sample and generate weights, and then weight the sample in the analyses. Or work on a subset of the data. Sequence length is another limitation, and that's limited to pretty much 100 to 300 time periods. So changing the granularity is a way to fix that. Going to a less granular time scheme, or working on subintervals of the sequences. Alphabet size has a limitation because if you're using colors to render it, you have to use a small enough number of colors that people can perceive the differences between the states. And if there is a larger alphabet, you can merge elements of the alphabet. With the antibiotics data, I actually had an alphabet of 95 for any one day, and the number of courses across the entire data set was about over 4,000. But since I'm not rendering it, I'm just keeping it as the alphabetic letters, it works. And then with missing data, I talked about this very early on in the presentation, if you have missing data, depends on how much missing data you want to tolerate and where. And it's also possible to just add a code for missing states. Okay, software. R has Treminer extras, and weighted cluster packages. Stata has an SQADOS module. CHISA is another one, and that was developed for other alignment methods where people wanted to get away from the optimal matching and wanted to better account for subsequences, or to look at multi-channel sequences. And then TDA is an older one. I don't think that one's supported anymore, and that was developed. It has capability of calculating optimal matching distances. And genomic software, I looked briefly at it and didn't really see an easy way to use it for this kind of data. Okay, so summary, what I covered is the brief history, some research questions, typical data sources, or types of data sources, and a broad overview of the capabilities of sequence analysis, particularly in Treminer, some limitations in software. So, thank you.